to ensure that subsequent guidance that may be provided, as well as making sure that we can get you guys hooked up with folks to answer your questions or provide some support for that. We're more than happy to do that and really see that as part of our role in this ongoing process. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So thanks again for having me join you guys this evening. As Tanya said, my name is Sam Holland. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Special Education and Student Services at the Virginia Department of Education. And I know that the state bureaucracy can seem very unwieldy at times, but I really take a lot of pride in the work that we do at the department, particularly in my department. As you can imagine, we handle all special education concerns, everything from monitoring to dispute resolution to professional development and technical assistance that supports our students every day, both inside and outside the classroom. And we're very proud that we're one of the only departments at VDOE that actually provides direct services to students. And we're so excited to be a part of this conversation. And I think one thing you'll see woven throughout my presentation this evening is really a lens of equity, particularly focused on our students that come from vulnerable populations. And I would say that always as a priority in our minds are students with disabilities, and realizing that we really need to think about them first as opposed to thinking about them last. So I'm going to share that and how our approach worked out for the state guidance development, and really kind of, you'll see that echoed through the words of both Governor Northam and our state superintendent for public instruction, Dr. James Lane. We're also responsible for student services in my department, which is a kind of generic term, but that identifies the specialized instructional support staff. So everything from our school counselors to our school psychologists to our school nurses, our Medicaid funding and coordinators. As you can imagine, we really see ourselves as helping to support that network of support and assistance that is so important to all of our students, and particularly to our students that may struggle or need additional support in order to be successful. So much of the work that we'll share today has been a labor of love for us over the last number of months, and I really hope that we're able to answer your questions, concerns, and at least give you a little bit of support moving forward. So at this point, I'm going to transition to some slides, and I'm going to go ahead and stop my video because I don't want it to mess up that. But let me go ahead and switch to some slides that I'd like to share with you all as we kind of intro our conversation this evening. And so as you can see, you know, this presentation is something that we worked with in tandem with the governor's office, and was really part of the rollout that we saw earlier this summer, and thinking about, as we return to school, what are some of the things we need to think about, and how has the department oriented its guidance in order to provide information and resources to local school divisions to then take and utilize in their own decision-making process. And the first thing that I want to say is that it's very important to note the pivot that is happening. Ever since mid-March with the extended school closures, we really saw a huge impact on what was being provided to students and families, and really, you know, what was next, right? After the closure, what was going to be offered? What are some of the supports that are there? And so I want to start off the conversation by just orienting us to the change that is happening, and that is that for the next academic year, which is 2020-2021, is that schools will open for all students, but instruction will look very different. And so this is something that's been receiving quite a bit of attention nationally as well. And thinking about, you know, during the extended school closures, we didn't see things like compulsory attendance laws. We didn't see things that really kind of, to us, are the framework for our brick and mortar schools. But now that we have time to orient ourselves to this work, it's really important to keep in mind that as part of the governor's update, he is asking and really, you know, telling Virginia schools are required to deliver new instruction to all students for the 2020-2021 academic year, and realizing that that instruction could look different depending upon where folks are in the Commonwealth. Some of that will happen in person, and some of that can and will take place via remote learning, which is really important. And we'll talk a little bit about why that flexibility is so key for us in Virginia. Another thing I want to orient us to is that, you know, obviously education is not the only sphere in which we operate, right? We've seen a lot of the reopening phases that affect businesses, you know, a lot of folks, their jobs, you know, their ability to travel, their ability to work, their ability to communicate. And so one thing that's been very mindfully done is that the Virginia Return to School Plan has aligned with what Governor Northam has termed the Forward Virginia Blueprint in phases. And so when you see the phases and when you see the numbered phases, there's no two sets of those. One set works for everybody. So most of you are aware that currently we are in phase 3. And I'll back it up a little bit and just go briefly over phase 1 and 2, because many of the questions that we received, I think, are very pertinent to that conversation. I want to make sure that folks have some answers on that piece. So, you know, along with this reopening phase and helping folks to kind of wrap their heads around what this could look like, we want to create a conversation around opportunities for in-person instruction, obviously that began immediately all the way back in phase 1 we talked earlier in June. Those pieces of flexibility really are oriented around not only addressing the academic component, but around the health, social, emotional, and physical well-being of students and staff. I think we can all agree that the impacts from those extended school closures have been far-reaching beyond just academic learning. And as I stated, you'll see a prioritization of the needs of what we consider our most vulnerable learners, particularly for those whom in-person instruction is most essential. And I would say for throughout our guidance, you'll see that specifically for students with disabilities, students who are learning English as a second language, and our youngest students, which are really identified as pre-K through 3rd grade, and most of the information we'll share today. So as I said, there really is a 3-phase plan, and currently we're in phase 3 at this point. And so I think it's important to kind of walk you through, just because there are, and I saw a question pop up in the Q&A about some of the offerings that happened during spring and summer. And so hopefully this will help to kind of orient you to what those have looked like. So one, there has been flexibility all the way from phase 1 about schools being able to offer in-person instructional options. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about phase 1, because there are a couple of components there that are really important, particularly for parents and families of students in special education. And you'll see that as each phase progressed, there is more flexibility that happens and able to extend in-person learning opportunities if that's appropriate for the local school division. One thing I will note is that you'll note we only go up to phase 3 currently. There's a low little term here beyond phase 3, right, which is the phase 4. And that is really something, I will be honest, that I don't have a lot of information to share with you about this evening. These are things that are happening, and we'll develop future guidance. And I think a lot of that is really based on the health data and information that will be coming out of the governor's office and the office of the health commissioner. Something else that's really important is that these phases provide the maximum flexibility, right? So in going into this conversation, it was really around how much flexibility can we offer? And the department's role, as we saw it, was to really create maximum flexibility while still offering some limited components of that may be appropriate. And one thing I'm always reminded of is Northern Virginia, right? So if we look at health data and we hear some of the concerns coming out of Northern Virginia, we know that the health data and the information there looks a lot different than it does in other parts of the state, particularly a great comparison is Southwest Virginia, that has had a lot less number of cases. And, you know, you can really draw a pretty stark comparison about how the effect has worked in both of those communities. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the flexibility that's there and how divisions can or are not taking advantage of that flexibility. And I think that's really helpful in bringing back conversations to your local school divisions. You know, one thing that you may or may not be aware of is that in the Commonwealth, there really is kind of a delineation of role and responsibility when it comes to public education. The state takes it to a point, and this guidance is a great example of taking it to that point and sharing, you know, what is information based on data, based on research that we have available as kind of general guidance for the whole state. But then how we see that guidance kind of lay out in local school divisions depends upon the community, not only the needs of the community, but in this case, you know, a lot about the implications of the pandemic and things that still might be challenging specific areas in the state. So phase 1, you saw, was the most restrictive when it came to the health mitigation strategies. And so you see a lot of these things that we talked about, things like 6-foot social distancing, the closing of communal spaces, no large gatherings. But one thing that's really important was that in-person instruction could have been offered to students with special education. So I'm going to switch real quick on my screen, and I want to share a document that I think will be really helpful in kind of drilling this down to something more specific. And so I'm going to start here on the Virginia Department of Education website because I want you to be able to get to this if you need it. And we're going to start right here at the Recover, Redesign, Restart 2020. And this document, I refer to it as kind of the big book of school reopening from the Virginia Department of Education. This is a really comprehensive guide for what we are advising school divisions to consider as they reopen. And I'll orient you to a couple of pieces in it that might be super helpful for you to draw from and information. But what I want to link you to specifically is some of the information that has been shared for the phased reopening for Virginia schools that's contained right here. And so this information, like I said, was last updated on Monday and is really important to consider because it walks you through the specific phases. And I'm not going to take the time to kind of go through this letter, but it's right here if you need it. And so what's really important that phase one is that it did two things for students with disabilities, or I think that have the impact to really affect some of the work and honestly some of the questions that we saw from folks as we led up to tonight. So the two things are, one is it provided for in-person instruction for students with disabilities. And I think this was an effort to really think about the utilization of extended school year services, summer learning opportunities. But if you'll notice within that language, there are some really specific pieces to that, right? The first is that it has to match with the student's individualized education program. So it requires that team to really consider if it's appropriate, because as you can imagine, there are students out there that in-person instruction might be the most valuable way for them to receive academic support. However, maybe they're a student with a significant health condition as well. And so we're turning to an area that might be more high risk, may not be the best fit, may not be the best thing appropriate for that student at that time. So it creates a conversation to say this flexibility is available, who might it be appropriate for? The other issue is that in thinking about some of the populations, and I would venture a guess as to a lot of the populations that we see in our work through with the ARC is that we're encountering a lot of students with significant cognitive disabilities. And a student like that may not be able to adhere to some of those mitigation strategies that are put in place to support them. So it might be a much larger conversation about, you know, how do we approach helping students to distance appropriately? How do we approach students wearing a mask appropriately? And we'll talk a little bit about resources that are available for that, but I think it's done with a lens of making sure that this decision is made upon the best interest of the student and the needs of that student. So that was what the guidance offered as far as flexibility, right? Was to kind of put it on the IEP teams to kind of work through some of these issues and concerns and supports and see if this is a viable option. There was also a reminder there that there have been no changes or flexibility from the federal government to IDEA, which translates to there are no rule changes in how IEPs are conducted, and the fact that in Virginia they require parental consent for any change in placement. And so it was really done with a mind to say this should be a collaborative process, and most importantly, that parents should have to consent to receiving those services. And that was a reflection of everybody being on the same page as to what some of the risks would be and some of the needs of that student. And this might be just the start of those conversations. The other thing in phase one that was really important was that it gave a superintendent discretion on opening school buildings within a school division. And when you first hear that, you're like, oh, Sam, you know, I don't really care. But this has a direct implication on testing students. This guidance was created in order to offer flexibility for secure testing of students. Everything from a WISE test for economic development credit that we have, all the way to considering the fact that the extended closures may have necessitated an extension of something like the 65-day timeline in order to appropriately assess the student. And for those of us who have worked with younger students, we know that virtual assessments, even if able to overcome the security provisions to do that, may not be the best fit for some of our youngest learners. And so while it seems really simple, this is a great point to take back. And I would encourage any of you who are within the evaluation and eligibility process or have fielded questions about it or have been in the middle of reevaluation with some specific components to definitely reach out to your school division and see how they have responded to this flexibility and what that guidance looks like I'll be honest, I've spoken with a couple of folks in the field, and they have told me that they have been really consistent in only opening a couple of sites and having specific practitioners work a very regimented schedule. So a school psychologist may be on duty, 3 days a week. They might have their audiologist in the building every other day. So they work to utilize this flexibility in order to kind of catch up and create an environment to conduct some of those assessments that may have been waiting in the queue, if you will, since the extended closure. So that flexibility was provided in phase 1. And I'm well aware that we're in phase 3 now, but keep in mind, those things that are provided in the earlier phases continue to be offered throughout the next phases. So hopefully that's created some time for divisions to develop plans and develop their approaches to offering that flexibility if it's appropriate. And that should really be something that's on your radar if you're fielding questions or have a concern in that area. So I'm going to transition back to my slides for just a second and walk through the remaining phases, and we'll close that out and start to get into some nitty-gritty details of resources that can be helpful for you guys. And so as we see transitioning from phase 1 to phase 2, we definitely see that the parameters are starting to relax a little bit, right? And we see here that not only are we talking about in-person services for students with disabilities as we were in phase 1, but now we're talking about in-person services for students who are learning English as a second language, as well as some of our youngest learners. And I hope you're seeing a pattern in that in research, we have populations of students that might not benefit the most for virtual instruction. And I'm sure that many of the students within these 3 groups kind of were first on your list of thinking, who struggles with the virtual learning and remote learning environment. And these groups are definitely ones that came to thought, and who do we want to assign as a priority for getting them back in and receiving in-person instruction and supports as quickly as possible as appropriate. And so obviously now we're in phase 3, and this happened relatively recently, and we see that this shift has definitely brought us the closest to having the most students available for in-person instruction. And I've heard a lot of school divisions that have already made their decisions, have really talked about a staggered scheduling approach, and have moved down that line of considering more in-person instruction based upon this flexibility. This is a great example of how things can change really rapidly. I shared earlier on our website that there was kind of an alert that showed that there were some updates as of Monday to this. And if you'll note on this slide, it talks about 6-foot physical distancing. However, we know in the most recent update that was provided by the governor's office, we now see an alignment with updated information that's coming from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, of which all VDOE guidance ultimately kicks back to, as far as health mitigation strategies, everything from cleaning to physical distancing. But we now see a shift away from not just 6-foot physical distancing, but 3-foot physical distancing with the use of a mask. And so you can see that that may not seem like a big issue, but for all of those challenges that we're now considering and thinking about returning to school in the fall, just think about being on a school bus and think about the difference it makes in being required to maintain 6-foot physical distancing as opposed to 3-foot physical distancing with a mask. And so I think this is a great example to show you that we'll talk through a lot of things this evening, but information is coming out so rapidly. And, I've heard a couple of resources this week that have even talked about an update to the CDC guidance. And so I really just want you to take this as a reminder to be a savvy consumer of information and making sure that you are oriented to the updates that are coming out so quickly, because as those happen, they may precipitate changes in conversation. They may precipitate updates and guidance plans and approaches. And I think it's really helpful for parents and families to be able to have those informed conversations with their communities, whether that be your school community or your support community as well. I'm also not going to get really deep into some of these other areas, but I'm sure many of them have created interest as far as extracurricular activities, student sports. There's a lot of information here that should you be so inclined, it's really helpful to kind of work your way through and maybe ask some more specific questions as they come up and as they may be aligned to some of the things that you've questioned yourself. So there are some precautions, and I think you'll see this very consistently, not only in the department guidance, but also in the information that comes directly from the governor's office. And that is, we've seen some really consistent guidance from the CDC and some things that have really up until this point become non-negotiable. And those precautions include things like daily health screenings, providing exceptions for certain groups, whether that be staff or students, to participate in some remote or virtual opportunities, particularly those at higher risk and may have some of the chronic health conditions that have been identified and as such may be at a higher risk for exposure and subsequent infection from COVID. And then obviously the utilization of things like masks and physical distancing in order to mitigate risk, and really think about how to use these in the building blocks that kind of pave our way back to brick and mortar instruction. I do want to note that there are some really specific guidance documents, and I'll share a number of those with you this evening, but I think it's really helpful to make sure that you're getting that information as quickly as possible. And so I am going to click out of this one, and I think you guys should now be looking back at the Virginia Department of Education's site that I showed you earlier. And so, you know, a couple of things that I want to note is that everything about school reopening on our website is going to be easily accessible from the homepage. We're really trying our best to make what is not always an easy to access website very plain and very oriented to things that you want to know as quickly as possible. The one thing I will note is if you're new to surfing the web for VDOE, when you get to this site, there'll be a little prompt box that opens up and says, do you want to share your contact information with the department? And I know all of us probably need one less robo email, you know, in our inboxes, but I really want to encourage you to sign up for that. It is a piece of information that we use, and there's also a sign up box here on the bottom. It's called Gov Delivery. And it'll offer you some really specific options as far as areas and priorities that you want to learn more about. One of those areas is family and parent resources. And this provides a very detailed update to your inbox around some of the topics that we'll be talking about today, whether it be updated guidance, whether it be training opportunities and opportunities to you know, learn from some of the folks in the field, links to resources that may be helpful for support. So I really want to encourage you, particularly if you're helping to support families, to sign up for those Gov Delivery updates, because they will provide real-time information and they'll be delivered right to your inbox and can allow you just to click on the things that are interesting to you. And if not, all you do is you lose a click to trash it. So would really encourage you guys to take advantage of that, because it's become a great way for us to reach directly out to parents. And I promise you, they will never be more than a page long. It's very quick, designed to give you just a few tidbits of things that might be interesting. And so a couple of pieces that I want to orient you to are the document that I mentioned, R3, which I'll go into in just a second. But quickly, I want to talk a little bit about closure, because many of the questions that were shared directly related to, hey, this happened during closure. I have a question about the type of services that my student was provided. You know, what am I to expect about, you know, the virtual provision of related services? And so I think it's really helpful to kind of take a little bit of a look back. And how I got here was that I was on the homepage and I clicked right here to COVID-19 and Virginia Public Schools. And if you scroll down, there's a section that contains all of the resources from our Department of Special Education and Student Services. And there are a lot of great resources here, but the biggest thing that is probably super helpful based on many of the questions that we got is our separate FAQ for special education here. And you'll see, while a very lengthy document, it's oriented and organized in a way so that you can click on the area that you may have questions about. And so, you know, I saw a lot of questions about children who are going through the evaluation and eligibility time period. You know, must evaluations be completed during school closure? What are some of the flexibilities that are there? And also, what do school divisions, what are they still required to do? And so each of these are a very quick Q&A, but gives you some additional information. It also, where available, can link to another resource and support. And one thing I will say is that if you access this document and you find a Q&A that you think is going to answer your question and it doesn't, please don't hesitate to contact our office. And our contact information is on the website. We also have a parent ombudsman and a family engagement staff that are committed to doing really quick turnaround for telephone calls and emails that come in asking specific questions. And so just because we don't have a Q&A here that might address your specific concern, please don't hesitate to bring that to our attention. We're constantly updating this document, and many of those things that come into us help us to update it in a way that's beneficial to many parents and families and not just to your individual question. And so there's a lot here. The crux of this guidance, though, really focuses on what was not changed. And you may have heard me earlier mention the fact that there has been no flexibility from the U.S. Department of Education or the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, which talks about IEP flexibilities, right? And for those of you who have been in education or dealt with education a while, you know that that's pretty typical, right? Even in pretty large-scale natural disasters, they really don't look at changing what's in federal statute. And as such, everything that's contained within federal statute as well as state regulation for us here in Virginia is still in play and was never out of play. So I had a lot of questions that came in that Tanya shared with me on, you know, what should I expect from my IEP team meetings? How should my participation change? How should I be notified? What if I was sent home an amendment and I don't understand it? So I definitely think it would be helpful to consult this FAQ so that when you're having a conversation with your case manager or you receive a piece of information in the mail, that you're able to really ask questions to, one, make sure that you're informed of your rights, two, that you really have a good grasp on what the change is, what the update is, and how it impacts your students, and three, as always, being afforded an opportunity to have a more robust conversation about how this affects your student and questions and concerns you might have as it relates to that. So I think that's really important for parents to know. Sometimes it can feel like with so much going on, maybe I missed it and this is happening to everybody. And so I think it's really helpful to know that the rules of the game have not changed. Everything is still in play as far as the requirements, as far as parental consent, as far as the process. And so, you know, don't feel pressure to make a decision that you don't understand. That's something we always want to make sure that parents and families understand. And we're really lucky in Virginia. Not only do we have a really robust advocacy organization framework, of which the ARC is a huge part, we have a National Parent Resource Center that's available, the PTI, the Parent Education Advocacy Training Center. There are numerous organizations that I know I speak for them when I say we're here to support and make sure that families and parents understand what they're coming in contact with and how to continue to be a strong advocate for their students. So I'm going to pause there on the special ed specific. And like I said, this FAQ is oriented around closure. We will be updating a lot of this information to handle questions that come in about reopening, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how we've approached that thus far. But I know that this kind of seems like it's in our rear view, but I think it can still be a valuable piece of information, particularly if you're still struggling to kind of unpack what happened in the spring and thinking about the provision of support over the summer as well. So I am going to transition now to the R3 documents. And as I mentioned, this is really the big book of school reopening from the Virginia Department of Education's perspective. And it was really oriented around how can we provide as much information and detail as possible to really equip school staff and school leadership in saying, okay, you know, what does reopening look like for Jefferson County? You know, what are some of the things that we can consider? And while I would not advocate reading this book from front to back, it's very large unless you get in the transportation section, sometimes that can lull you into a really nice sleep, at least for me. There are a couple of areas that I think are really pertinent to many of the folks that are joining us on this call, and I just want to point out a couple of them. The first is our parent and family resources section. There are a lot of great resources here, as well as talking about what the role of parent and family engagement and involvement should be in helping schools to capitalize on that communication, as well as benefiting from that perspective in their planning on return to school and reopening schools. And so we have a lot of this information provided. A lot of it is translated into Spanish. We continue to work on getting multiple versions out in multiple languages and are really just working to kind of play catch up with so much of that. But this is a great piece to just link in if you're struggling around, you know, how can I engage? What is my role within reopening? You know, how can I support my student who may be struggling, you know, socially, emotionally from the closures, everything from dealing with depression to building a schedule for your family, to teaching young students and students with disabilities, how to hand wash appropriately. There is a bunch of stuff here that can be really helpful. And for those of you who work to support other parents and families, it's a great way to capitalize on resources, not having to recreate the wheel. If you see a couple of things in here that you like, take those links, that information, share it out with the folks that you support. I think that's really helpful. The other area is here in student and staff supports. And I'm aware that we're really oriented tonight in talking about families, parents, and caregivers, but another area is our educators and our support staff. How are we talking in a way that really gives, I think, a lens to what their return to school will look like and some of the challenges that they will be facing. And this really lays out a way to approach that work that I think speaks to assuring staff about their safety, their communication, but also helping to prepare them for the challenges that lie ahead. For anybody on the phone who's been a teacher, regardless of what age or content area you've taught, that it's a really demanding profession. And you can imagine that after the closure, we're all going to be kind of coming back into the classroom with not only dealing with academic, impact, but also the impact socially and emotionally to our students physically. Everything from, school nutrition to school health, how are we preparing nurses to be more effective? And so this is a really great resource, and I think focuses a lot on social emotional learning pieces that are super helpful to help support staff and students. And there's some really great one-pagers here around social emotional learning support that can be great to print out and share, just PDF and send to some folks oriented around specific populations like early learners, military connected families, families who have students with disabilities. There really is kind of something there for everyone, particularly on some of the more vulnerable populations that we work with in our department. The last and most important area is this one, focused around instruction. Now, one thing I hear a lot from folks is like, where's the special ed task force? Where's the special ed report? And I want to be very clear in saying that I think a lot more of our problems could be solution oriented if we really thought about robust, well-rounded, well-resourced, well-specialized instruction for all students. And so you'll see that this instruction section is really meant to be comprehensive and working with any student, whether that be a neurotypical student, whether it be a student that's been identified for enrichment learning opportunities, whether it be a student that was recently immigrated to the United States and does not speak English, whether it be a student with severe dyslexia or a student with an emotional disability. We really need to approach instruction and learning in a way that speaks to being individualized and supportive of a variety of learners, regardless of what label we feel like is the most appropriate to identify a student. And so this section really contains some of the individualized supports that are most important. And I want, as part of a takeaway from this, for you to realize that the component that I think is the most appropriate is thinking about what does the world look like when we return to school. And if you can imagine, for many of our students, the extended school closures, whether they were able to participate in full with whatever continuity of learning activity there was, with whatever virtual or remote instruction was offered, you can imagine that for every student, this has had an impact on them. So the first rule should really be about, one, getting kids back so that we can fully evaluate and assess where they are. Because in order to have a conversation about how we structure the academic year, how to think about how we overlap curriculum to pick up those missing components from the spring, that conversation has to begin now, and the planning for that has to begin now. And then as we move into the academic year, how are we building stop points in order to assess students and see what's working, what have they gained, what have they lost, are they still not progressing as we intended? And that really unfolds a whole different conversation. And I think for those of us who work with students in special education, this is something that's kind of struggled, right? Because IDEA and the special ed regulations in Virginia, they weren't built for this. We really didn't think about, I wonder what the impact of the pandemic would be and what we should think about that. But the structure for support is there. And so one thing I will say that I'm not able to share a lot about this evening, but that is coming, is a much more concerted effort and guidance around how we should think about services and support to students with disabilities as a result of the school closure. And this might be a nuance for many folks on the call, but many of us have probably heard about compensatory education and compensatory services. And that's typically involved when there's been a failure to provide a free and appropriate public education or FAPE to a student with a disability. So you can imagine, you know, an example would be an IEP team has placed a student at a private school for students with disabilities, thinking that this is going to be the best environment in place for them. And that student has not succeeded, has not thrived, has not grown within that environment. How do we think about then coming back to the table and saying, okay, this isn't working for Sam? You know, how do we kind of evaluate that and readjust based on that? And so that's where the term compensatory comes from. It says that sometimes, you know, if things don't happen the way that they're supposed to, how do we provide a safety net, a stopgap to ensure that even if that happens, students still get what they need? And so I guess that this isn't a situation that we normally see with compensatory services, but it is a situation for recovery services. There are going to be students out there that have really struggled and have lost ground and have not been able to fully engage in learning in a way that is beneficial to keep them on track. So we have got to be responsive to that and think about the structures and supports that we build in order to assess them, figure out what they need, and how to get it to them. So one thing I do want to let you know, and I will be sure to, when this is finalized, shoot it directly to Tanya, we are developing a guidance document for an approach to recovery services that really says, you know, this is going to be an issue for students. How can we approach it? What's the legal framework for that? And then most importantly, how do we kind of do this boots on the ground? What are some of the building blocks that we need for this decision-making process so that IEP teams can walk through it in a way that is meaningful for the students that they serve? So I want to let you guys that information is coming. I saw a lot of questions that were shared around compensatory services, recovery services. My kid has missed out. What are some next steps? What's available to me? And I think that this guidance document will be really helpful to kind of have in hand and maybe look at specifically and think for your specific situation, what are some of the questions you want to come to the table with your IEP team, and talk about what the impact and what the next steps are for your specific student. So that is coming. That is not on the website yet. It will be posted, but I know that Tanya will help me make sure that you guys have access to that. I am hopeful that that is like a week away, so we're hoping to be able to publicly disseminate that next week. And that is something that we've had a lot of requests for. I'll be honest, guys, it's not just from parents. We've had a lot of requests from school division leaders, school administrators, because I think they're really well aware of that, and they want to have some time to think about, okay, how can we planfully approach that, and most importantly, how can we work to support our teachers and IEP teams in having those conversations? So we heard loud and clear that that was something that was needed. I know, you know, nothing comes out as soon as we want it, but we have taken the time to make sure that we're gathering really important information from other states, you know, seeing what examples are out there, and then taking the time to really consider that lens for Virginia. And there's information updated even this week from national advocacy organizations on this topic. So it really is growing and changing. And I think our role is to support the conversations that need to happen in order to provide, you know, successful outcomes for all of our students. So I know that was a really long way, and I gave you a little bit of a teaser about that guidance document that's coming out, but a lot of information here in the instruction section is really pertinent. And you'll see that, you know, I think one statement that really helps to identify it for our point of view is that school divisions will need to plan and implement efficient and effective ways to determine learning gaps that had manifested and grown during the extended school closure. They need to address those learning gaps through revisions to curriculum and pacing, and to prepare students and teachers for the various models of instructional delivery. That's actually in the forward of the document, and I really just want you all to hear, you know, very clearly that this has been a priority for how we have framed our guidance, and I really hope that that is echoed on the local level with the conversations that you're having. And you know, even if you don't feel that it is, a lot of this information can help empower you to have those conversations, which is really important, particularly with other parents and families. but most importantly, be a component to how you effectively advocate for your student, and really come to the table as an informed, as the expert on your kid, and having some of those tools in your toolbox to be able to pull from. So that's the big book of school reopening. I mentioned here these 3 areas right here I think would be the most pertinent to some of the conversations we're having this evening, as well as some of the questions. And one thing I will commit to doing is that if we can help to orient you within this monster to anything additional, or help to support you in finding the information that you need, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And I know Tanya mentioned in the Q&A that we're going to try and collect questions that are coming in through chat in order to make sure that we are able to push out information. I know that we're not in a position, being at the state level, able to answer every question, but being able to help facilitate those conversations is really important to us as well. So let me just get oriented here around our main document, and I'm just going to take us back, and I just want to offer a reminder here. You'll see here on the screen, I mentioned that Monday things were updated, particularly around the 3-foot physical distancing with a mask, and so anytime something like that happens, there's going to be a big red box here with an exclamation point that lets you know, hey, this is something that's changed. And for those of you guys who have either been tuning into the governor's press conferences or kind of hearing about them by the by, whether you are able to tune into those or not, you'll be able to get a direct line to anything that's impacted public education here on our site. And typically when he makes an announcement, it becomes a headline here. So it's very easily accessible for you and able to kind of say, okay, I heard that he was on talking about schools today, what did he say? And so I hope that this maybe takes a little bit of a load off as far as thinking about how to gain as much information as quickly as possible for you. So one other thing that I want to share are just a couple of next steps when it comes to support that we're able to offer for school divisions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a minute because I think this is really important. So a couple of things that I wanted to make sure you guys kind of had a heads up on. One was the guidance document on recovery services that we talked about. I think that's a huge piece of the information and questions that we've seen and some of the things that people want to know more about. The other thing is the fact that CARES funding is also en route. So many of you may have seen local and state headlines around the allocation of CARES Act funding. And so I kind of want to explain it this way. There, in a pot, there was all the CARES Act funding. 100% of those funds were here, right? They came to Virginia. 90% of those funds flowed directly to school divisions. So, I saw a lot of Central Virginia articles that talked about, we're using CARES Act funding for computers. We're using CARES Act funding for school nutrition. We're using CARES Act funding for personal protective equipment. 90% of that pot flowed directly to school divisions, just like our Title I funding does, right? It's based on a formula. It depends on your student population, and that money just kind of automatically trickles down into the locality's budgets, and they use it for a variety of purposes. Now, one thing I will tell you is that I think any local special education director will tell you that they probably didn't get a lot of that pie, right? When that money flowed directly down to school divisions, a lot of those folks were used for things that have really been hit hard by the closure and may, have created budget shortfalls and, subsequent issues that, if you think about, are a lot of fires to be put out. So that money was used to really meet the needs of the school division for whatever that priority was. Now, remember I said 90% flowed directly through to school divisions. That leaves 10%, right? So 10% of that money stayed at the state level. And that was a decision that flexibility allowed for in that law. So what it does is it allows for disbursement of those funds, spending of that money, to happen from the state level. And as you can imagine, the next question is, well, what are we going to spend this money on? And so that was a conversation that happened with leadership from the Department of Education, as well as input from the governor's office. There's also a component of funding there that's called GEAR. And I'm sorry, I wish I could tell you the whole names of the acronym, but it's late on a Thursday and I'm on the struggle bus when it comes to that. But the GEAR and CARES Act funding, which came through elementary and secondary education, called ESSER, regardless, these funds were utilized at the state level to support priorities that each state identified. And so as you can imagine, in Virginia, those priorities were really clear, right? From our guidance, what did we talk about? We talked about students with disabilities. We talked about virtual learning platforms. We talked about wireless and internet access. You know, those have been some of the really top tier concerns that we've heard from across the state. So as such, that 10% of money started flowing into specific pots that were then able to be allocated or applied for from the school divisions. And so one thing I would tell you is that you guys are hearing about this first because it has not been published as a superintendent's memo yet. When it is, it will definitely be on the website as well. But this funding allows for an opportunity for school divisions to seek additional support in those priority areas. And so I'm not going to talk a lot tonight about internet access and virtual learning platforms because we could spend hours doing that, right? But those are some of the areas of which funding is available. I'm going to talk to you about 3 pots of funding that go directly through our department that I think are really important to you guys. I'll talk about 2 of them really quickly because one is around social emotional learning and around creating support for school divisions to use an assessment in the fall to gauge, you know, the impact of the extended school closures on student social emotional learning. And many of our school divisions are engaged in this work. They were doing it before the closure. They'll continue it after the closure. But this resource is available so school divisions can go after it. It's competitive. So they have to answer a few questions if they want, you know, they want to have a seat at the table to talk about is the assessment they want to use evidence-based, you know, how are they going to use it to mitigate the issues that have come as a result of extended closures, you know, how are they going to use that data to inform their practices and programs. So SEL assessment, social emotional learning assessment, is a pot of funds that is available. And forgive me if I misspeak, I believe it's a pot of $750,000 that is available for SEL assessment. And so that'll be something that school divisions can apply for. So that's number 1. Number 2 is around school mental health support. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of school divisions that have a really robust network of school mental health. There are many more divisions that struggle to appropriately staff what we know that they would tell you their needs are when it comes to specialized instructional support, right? So there are a lot of kind of what we call base staffing for positions like school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers. And we know that there's a far greater need than sometimes what the funding is there to cover. So this competitive funding allows for school divisions to be in the mix to get, and it's $500,000 that's available for school mental health that they can pull from to support, whether it be positions, whether it be support programs or curriculum. And so those funds can kind of flow directly to those school mental health pieces. And I'm sorry, I know I'm not supposed to be looking at the chat and the Q&A, but I just can't help it. I'm trying to kind of keep it in. So the money is, you have to kind of enter in through one of these routes to get that money, right? So if it's SEL assessment, you enter in on that route to get that money. If it's school mental health, you enter in on that route. There are multiple other routes for internet connectivity, you know, to buy MiFi, to buy laptops, to buy a virtual learning platform, to buy personal protective equipment, to buy cleaning supplies. There are so many opportunities through CARES Act that we're not going to talk about, but will be available. And when that superintendent's memo comes out, it'll provide kind of a one-stop shop for seeing what all of those are and what the different opportunities are, right? Because I think at the local level, some of those things are going to kind of be what we call formula-based, meaning you kind of get a piece of the pie automatically, and some of them are going to be, as I've mentioned, competitive, meaning a division is going to have to express an interest and kind of go after it for that funding to be provided to them. The last pot is probably the most important one, at least for the conversation we're having tonight, and that is a pot of money that is 100% identified for students with disabilities. The main priorities of this pot of funding are for services and staffing, because we heard very clearly from local school divisions, what are your top 2 needs? And their needs are staffing to support things like physical distancing, staffing to support if we need to spread kids over multiple classrooms, if the social distancing stuff comes into play, we might have to split groups of kids up. So staffing is obviously a huge component of that. The other part that I mentioned is services, right? Everything from some of those recovery services to being able to offer multiple services and supports for students with disabilities. So $5 million of CARES Act funding has been specifically earmarked for students with disabilities. This will be formula-based, meaning that if you are a school division in the Commonwealth that has students with disabilities identified through your December 1 count, you will get money for those students. So that is an automatic, you don't have to competitively go after for this money. Everyone's going to get their kind of proportionate piece of that $5 million pie. Now, just a quick aside, because I don't want to get too deep in this, because I want to be responsive to your needs, but many of you have probably heard about the equitable services provision, and we may also have folks on the call that students are being served, whether it's placed by a local school division or whether it's a parental placement in a private school. And so part of the strings tied to this money is around an equitable services provision, meaning that for each student that is served in a private school within the jurisdiction of that county or city, they have to have an opportunity to receive those funds to support those students, just like a public school student. So many of you have probably heard a lot of stuff in the news about, you know, allocating funding to private students, special education, public school, you know, all of this stuff comes in. So that is what that means. It means that when the federal government put this money down on states, it was really thinking about how can it be used to support all students with disabilities and building in assurances or strings to that money to ensure that at the local level, that collaboration and support, you know, should really be there. So those are things that I think they get really tied up in some of the fiscal specifics of the language, but I just want you to know, if you've heard about that, that's what it's alluding to, is that this funding has been identified to support students that are served in a variety of settings, not just in public schools. So that kind of brings us to the summary of the CARES Act funding. And like I said, it's a much bigger piece of the pie. It's a much bigger component for all of those opportunities that are available for school divisions. But I really think those three that we discussed around social emotional learning assessment, school mental health professions and support, as well as the special education piece, are the ones that probably will come up the most in our conversation this evening. So I hope that's helpful. You kind of know now a couple of things that are coming down the road that can directly affect the population of students that we're talking about this evening, whether it be subsequent specific guidance around recovery services or the CARES Act funding to support some of the priorities that have been identified. And, you know, how do we have the resources to do the things that we need to do and that we want to do in order to ensure that transition back to the, you know, school brick and mortar environment is as positive and successful as possible. So I'm going to pause there and transition. I definitely want to make sure, and I'm keeping an eye on time, to make sure that we can provide some resources, because I think it's really helpful that we've had a lot of concerns and questions about, I see these health mitigation strategies, I see some of the things that are being put out, you know, that seem really simple, right? You know, we talk about wearing a mask, we talk about physical distancing, but we know that for many of our students, and this is not just students with disabilities, for many of our students, these aren't simple things, and we really need to have conversations about how best to educate students, how best to support students, and most importantly, as educators, how to teach students, right? And I always liken it to the work that I did previously. You know, it seems like years ago, and it was, but I was a special education teacher, and I worked primarily with students with significant cognitive disabilities and students with autism. And I always remember having the conversation about, you know, sometimes we have to explicitly teach students something that we kind of take for granted that most of us know, right? I used to use the example of a kindergarten, you know, circle playtime mat, right? When the teacher went to read a book, there were colored circles on the rug, and, you know, all the little bodies found their little circle, but maybe there was one student that didn't want to sit in the circle, didn't know they had to sit in the circle, so they wanted to go, you know, sit in the closet, because we hadn't taken the time to explicitly teach. When, you know, when Sam is reading to the class, we want all of our students to pick their circle and sit there so that they can listen and, you know, learn and participate. And so having conversations around explicit instruction to teach things that are outside of kind of the academic environment is something that's still really important. I think is even more timely now with some of the conversations and support that we're talking about students needing, particularly in the environment that we find ourselves in. So real quick, let me share my screen and just point to a couple of great sources of information that may be helpful to consider as you're looking for resources, and most importantly, if you're working to support teachers or if you are a teacher, a great place to kind of shop for additional information that may be really helpful to some of the challenges that you might be facing and as you prepare to serve your students appropriately. And so I'm going to share the website for the Virginia Autism Center for Excellence. And I think this is a great one to start with because there's a lot of information here that's really valuable. And I would even, I would even take the time to say that it's really valuable for individuals that may not be identified with autism. There's a lot of great behavioral support here and work that can really lend itself across multiple disability categories. And so I think it's a great resource to have in your back pocket, even if you don't normally work with students who are identified with autism. And so here are some examples here that we see, just a couple of things on their homepage. But if we look over here, they have a COVID-19 site. And this is some great pieces of information. One, they have some great videos about how to support families and the professionals who are working maybe in homes or working to support kids as they consider a transition back to the public school environment. And so a couple of pieces that I wanted to share here are just some great videos about, what could this return to school look like? How does the role of trauma inform that? How can we best be oriented to support students and staff as they come back to schools, and thinking about how to plan appropriately for that as well. And so there is even some information about helping explain, what COVID-19 is, and what does the virus do, and why are we talking about all this? Why is it important? What to do if we get sick? These are some great pieces here about helping individuals with autism understand how to wear different types of masks, and includes clips for seeing other students model how to wear those masks and what might be some of the challenges that might happen, and how to support folks in getting more acclimated and comfortable in wearing some of the personal protective equipment, I think, is really important in order to assure that we're, as prepared as possible to meet some of the things that have happened or will happen as a result of in-person instruction. There's also some additional here on physical distancing. What does that look like? And the great thing is that for all of us who have worked with visual supports, we've probably seen a lot of examples of that in everything from our local grocery store to waiting in the doctor's office. And so, how can we utilize some of those supports, and how can we structure a classroom in order to be as supportive as possible to help students as they return to that environment, and then making sure that we keep them and our staff and our families as safe as we can. Sorry, just taking a little bit of a water break. And there's, you see here some great stuff, how to teach hand washing, how to hand washing, what do some of these things look like at home, building a schedule, supporting, doing chores. I mean, it's just a treasure trove of information here. And the other great thing that ACE is doing is that they're offering an opportunity they call Lunch and Learns, and these are really short topical bursts that they're also housing here, I believe, that are online and able to be accessed after the fact. But it's great if there's a specific topic that you might be interested in and thinking about, how can I talk a little bit deeper about this, or, this might be a question or a concern that we're dealing with in my home, and how can I best support my student, and honestly, how can I support myself and other family members in really orienting ourselves around some of these supports that we feel are important for us. So like I said, just one example, the VCU Autism Center for Excellence. We have some great resources across the state, including our Center for Transition Innovations, our Accessible Instructional Materials Center that we have out of George Mason University. And you'll see many of these are highlighted within the instruction phase of the R3 document that I shared with you, and has a lot of great ways just to hyperlink and kind of quickly get to resources that may be helpful and appropriate for you, regardless of what your role is in supporting students with disabilities. And so I'm going to pop back here to the website, and I'm just going to start to kind of close this out a little bit by talking about some of the pillars of return to school for the upcoming 2021 school year. And so you'll see here there are a couple of pieces of information that'll be really helpful for you guys to know that are out there, specifically as you take questions back to your school division. And I see a lot of questions coming in about timeline of decision making, about options that have been offered to parents, about that decision making at localities. And so I think it's really important to realize that there is going to be a limit of how many of those very detailed questions I would even be able to answer, but most importantly can be answered at the state level, because as you can imagine, many of them depend upon the plan for reopening that your school division has. And we have divisions that are all over the map in those decision pieces, whether they have been, whether they have decided 2 weeks ago what their plan is, whether they're deciding right now, or whether they're not going to publish their plan until August. You know, there are folks all along that decision pathway that, you know, are in process. And so it's really hard to answer those questions when we don't have all of the information available that would be really helpful. So a couple of pieces here is that there are two requirements that are put upon schools as part of their reopening. The first is tied to an order from the Public Health Commissioner, and that is that before entering phase 2 or 3, every public and private school in Virginia is required to submit to us at the Department of Education a plan that outlines their strategies for mitigating public health risk of COVID-19. And so they have to put pen to paper and really think about how is our school or school division going to comply with CDC and the recommendations for the Virginia Health Department. And so this is really helpful. This information has been coming in, continues to come into the department. And so I hope that as part of your information gathering, you're seeking this information out at the local level as well, and really talking about, okay, you know, what is Jefferson County's approach to the health plan? You know, what are the things that you're going to put into place that keep my students safe? If you're a teacher, what are the things that are going to be in place in order to make sure that I'm not in it at a more advanced risk for being exposed to the virus? These health plans really walk through the submission piece for that. And so you can see here there's a little bit more in-depth information, everything from the guidance that we have provided, as well as a template document. You know, you can really get an idea of these. Now, the one piece of this is that these are not publicly posted on the DOE website. So additional questions or specific areas of consideration that you have an interest in should really be directed to your local school division. Or if your student is enrolled in a private school, they are also required to have this plan. So if you have questions, if you want to know more about this, this is really helpful to know, you know, where to ask and what this document is called. And so there is a second document that has not really started to come in as yet, because as you can see, these instructional plans are due 15 business days before the start of the division school year. And so these, as you can imagine, are kind of, you know, scattered and dependent upon what the division's plan is for the start of the 2021 school year. And so these instructional plans, which are different than the health plans, right? Because the health plans are all about those mitigation strategies and how are school divisions being responsive to planning for them proactively and what are they putting in place. These instructional plans are much more oriented about some of the things that we discussed earlier in that R3 document around instruction. And so how are we being the school division, you know, how are we orienting ourselves to be able to support all of our learners? What are the things that we're going to change about our curriculum timeline and framework? How are we supposed to, you know, approach the different services? If we're offering a blended format between virtual and in-person instruction, you know, how are we going to kind of plan for that? And if you look at this instructional plan guidance, there is some really specific language about supporting students with disabilities and other learners from vulnerable populations. And so this is really the department's piece of saying, okay, here's all the guidance, right? And then you're going to take that back to your local school division and kind of process it and plan and gather stakeholder involvement. What is the result of that? What is your plan going to be for the academic school year of 2020-2021? So you'll see here the guidance lays out some really specifics, and you'll notice some of that language that I mentioned here in that document. And then the submission link is here too. One thing I will note is that as part of this submission link, school divisions have to assure that this plan has been publicly posted on their website. And so this is kind of that other pillar of information that might be really helpful to question and ask about, and maybe dig into a little bit of detail given some of the concerns that you may have identified for your specific area of focus or for your student, of course. So These are a couple of things that might just be helpful to know. This is what the divisions are working on currently, and definitely, I think, is kind of their message to their community about what reopening looks like on an individualized basis. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for just a minute here. And one thing I want to make sure that I make really clear is, I've talked a lot during this conversation about the fact of, what we're hearing now and what we're talking about is, is now, Thursday at, 7 o'clock. These are the things that are happening now, but I think we can all appreciate the situation for what it is, that information is consistently coming in, decisions are being made, decisions might be altered, and so I hope that the information we discussed today has been helpful in just orienting you to kind of what's out there, and then how best to use that information, take it back to equip yourselves, but then also to ask questions and provide some additional support to those decisions that are being made for your community, for your school, and for your students' classroom. The other piece that I will offer is that obviously I've seen a lot of questions come in about, decisions that have been made at the local level. And I want to assure you that while the department continues to maintain communication and stay on top of it, as I mentioned, there is definitely a line of which local decision making takes precedence. And so a lot of the questions that we receive, talking about, I'm not satisfied with the division's decision on how learning is going to look, or I have questions, I want to know how this impacts my specific student with some of the situations that we've encountered. I think it's really helpful to know that those questions are best answered at the local level, and I think really can only be answered at the local level. And so, being informed of what the plan is, knowing what the flexibility of the plan and your role in it is a really powerful tool. And I think another piece is that we need to be aware of, for the decision that happens, for a Southwest school division that maybe hasn't had any impact from the virus, their return to school is probably going to look much different than, a Northern Virginia division that may be, severely impacted by the virus. And so, I know it's kind of maddening sometimes to hear it from our perspective, but just know that that's kind of the comprehensive nature of the work that we do, and being able to offer guidance that supports each of those divisions in a way that speaks to their specific situation is a challenge for sure. And I think we all appreciate, it feels like the season has been nothing but challenges, but I know that so much of the information that we've shared today, as well as hopefully some of the tools and resources, have been helpful. And so I'm just keeping an eye towards time, and so I'm going to start to wind down. And I just want to make a couple of notes. Once again, I want to say thank you so much for the time, the participation that you've had this evening. I'm well aware that for many of us, I have children myself, this is a difficult time in the evening to kind of get things straight. So I appreciate you taking some time out to join me. I know that I was not able to answer all questions, and I may not have been able to answer your question, or may be able to answer your question, but I hope that you're able to take some piece of information away from our conversation today that will be helpful to you having those subsequent conversations, and hopefully getting the answers that you need to make sense for your family, and most importantly for your student. The other thing I want to say is that I know that this has been a really challenging time, for those of us who are educators, for those of us who are parents, regardless, grandparents, caregivers, babysitter, whatever it looks like, this has been really challenging, and I'm definitely aware that it's been really stressful. And, I just hope that you hear from us a goal of trying to ensure that we're understanding the situation, we're being as responsive as we are able. We're really sending a clear message as to what priorities should be, and putting things in place that reinforce those priorities. And most importantly, that we're open to having conversations and communication to make sure that we are all able to move forward and to really come out of this season of challenge with a plan that can really support not only your family, but most importantly, work around our students and ensure their outcomes for success. So Tanya, with that, I will pause and just say thank you and hand it back over to you for any instructions. I know there have been a lot of questions about how to access the presentation and recording, and I know you're going to give folks some great advice on that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you. That is an incredible amount of information that you've shared. So we will be happy to send recordings and links out to everyone. We'll post it on our website, but then we'll also take the email list of those who registered and send a handy quick link. As well as Sam and I will both take, she was very gracious to commit to looking at the questions that we've received during the conversation and creating some answers. We'll go back and forth, and if we get something put together in writing, what we'll do is we'll put that in the same place that we're posting the video. And that way everyone will have access to it. And again, we're just very grateful. It's really a great amount of information, a lot of resources for people to go to. And the thing I think that mattered the most is you are giving families and students the tools about what the expectations are in the local school divisions, so everybody can advocate for their specific circumstance and in their local area, because it looks different in different places. So thank you, thank you. We are very grateful. I am going to do a little plug to everyone, if I may, really quickly, as we wrap up, to remember that there are lots of things changing, as Sam said. So we have our convention coming up. Hopefully you're able to see that on the screen. That is August 3rd through 7th, and registration is open. If you go to the ARC's website, you can find out information about everything that's going to be happening. And actually, I'm trying to see, is that sharing? Is that showing? Okay. Anyway, sorry. You go to the ARC's website and look for events, and hopefully you'll all sign up for that. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Samantha. Okay.